The path into the woods was never meant to be walked after sunset, but the townspeople's warnings sounded more like superstition than danger. I stepped over the sagging fence, the rotting boards creaking beneath my boots, and felt the cold breath of the forest settle around me. Somewhere beyond the tree line stood the cabin, what was left of it, where the final generation of the Dunlow family lived before they vanished. Their history was a twisted knot of cousin weddings, a bloodline folded again and again until no one could tell where one branch ended and another began. But it wasn't the marriages that bothered me. It was the child. The one the records refused to name. The one locals described with trembling lips, as if giving it shape would summon it. They said it was born on a storm-heavy night 70 years ago, and that its cry didn't sound human. They said it didn't look human either, though anyone who had seen it never explained what they meant. They only whispered that the mother ran into the woods with it and never returned. As I moved deeper into the forest, the smell of wet earth thickened. Something shifted between the trees, a slow, deliberate movement. My flashlight flickered, then died, swallowed by the darkness. The silence around me grew heavy, as if the forest were waiting. A faint rustle came from behind the old cabin's collapsed roof, followed by a low sound, almost a breath, almost a word, but too distorted to be either. Whatever the Dunlows created over generations wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting for someone to find it. The discovery began when the historian, Elias Ward, arrived in the quiet county expecting nothing more than to verify a few outdated marriage records. What he found instead was a stack of brittle documents tucked away in a forgotten drawer of the old courthouse, each page holding a name that connected to another in an unbroken pattern. At first, it looked like nothing more than a coincidence. Small towns often had repeated surnames, but the more Elias traced the lines, the more the truth began to reveal itself. The same last names circled back every generation, sometimes skipping a branch, sometimes intertwining in ways that felt too deliberate to ignore. Cousins marrying cousins, sometimes first cousins, sometimes second, but always within the same narrow cluster of families. It was as if the bloodline was intentionally kept contained, guarded, and preserved. Elias felt a strange pull the deeper he went into the records, as though the past wanted him to uncover its secrets. He requested access to the handwritten logs from the early 1800s, their ink faded and edges eaten by time, and found the pattern stretching far longer than he initially believed. It wasn't just decades, it was well over a century. Each marriage record felt like a piece of a puzzle, but instead of forming an image, the pieces created a claustrophobic loop, a family tied so tightly to itself that no one outside ever seemed to enter. What unsettled Elias most wasn't the marriages but the omissions. Some birth entries ended abruptly with only a date and the words healthy child. Others had no name at all, only a hastily scribbled line as if someone didn't want to write down what they saw. A few records were marked with faint symbols, circles intersecting lines in shapes Elias didn't recognize, placing an unspoken emphasis on those particular births. As Elias mapped the genealogy on parchment, the family tree did not expand outward like others he had reconstructed. Instead, it curved inward, spiraling like a tightening coil. Generations folded back into each other, compressing the lineage until it felt suffocating even on paper. The air in the courthouse seemed to thicken as he worked, and a strange silence clung to the walls, broken only by the scratch of his pen. By the time he realized the final generation abruptly vanished from public records, he felt an uneasy pressure building behind his ribs. There was no explanation, no death certificates, no marriage records, nothing. The family simply stopped appearing, as though erased. But the gap didn't feel like a disappearance. It felt like a cover, a shadow pressed over something the town didn't want anyone to find. Rumors about the final child did not exist in any official document Elias found. Instead, they lived in the murmurs of the townspeople, carried like a draft through the narrow streets and creaking porches. It began subtly, through offhand comments made by older residents who lowered their voices the moment they sensed a stranger listening. Elias first heard it at the diner, where a pair of elderly men spoke in hushed tones about the thing born in the deep woods, their eyes darting toward the window as though expecting the forest itself to be eavesdropping. They never used its name, because no one, it seemed, knew one. They only referred to it as the child that couldn't be described, a phrase that sent a faint chill through Elias before he fully understood its weight. One woman, her hands trembling around her coffee cup, told him that when she was a girl, adults warned children never to wander beyond the third ridge, not because of animals or cliffs, but because something was out there that didn't belong to this world. When Elias pressed for details, she shook her head sharply, insisting it wasn't her story to tell and that talking about it only stirred old things awake. He noticed that whenever the final Dunlow child came up, people shifted uncomfortably, as though recalling something they wished their memory had forgotten. The rumors grew more tangible when Elias visited the county's outskirts, where the line between town and wilderness blurred. A reclusive hunter, whose cabin smelled of pine and gun oil, reluctantly admitted he had once seen something unusual near the abandoned homestead of the last Dunlow couple. He refused to describe it, not because he couldn't remember, but because he claimed memory itself rejected the image. It was, in his words, something the eyes weren't meant to look at for too long. He spoke of movement that didn't match the shape he thought he saw, of a figure that seemed both too small and too large at once, as if shifting between forms. Elias sensed that the hunter wasn't trying to frighten him. If anything, the man seemed afraid that speaking the truth might cause whatever he saw to return. Each story, though fragmented, carried a strange consistency. The child was real, it was wrong in ways no one could properly articulate, and it had vanished into the woods soon after birth. Locals insisted the mother ran with it, desperate or deranged, depending on which version was told. Some believed she hid it to protect the town, others thought she fled because she feared what she had brought into the world. Elias realized that this child, this unspoken anomaly, was at the heart of the Dunlow mystery, a living echo of generations of entangled bloodlines, and the reason silence hung so heavily whenever the woods were mentioned. It was the hunter's account that pushed Elias from curiosity into unease, because unlike the whispered rumors in town, this man spoke with the rigid tension of someone who had seen something he wished he hadn't. The hunter lived alone on the far edge of the forest, a place where the trees crowded so thickly that twilight settled early and left the air cold even in summer. His cabin was cluttered with traps, pelts, and jars of preserved herbs, but his eyes were alert and unblinking, the eyes of someone who had learned to survive in a place that tolerated humans rather than welcomed them. When Elias mentioned the Dunlow family, the man's jaw tightened as though he had bitten into something bitter. He didn't bother pretending he didn't know the story. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the forest through the open door, as if expecting it to answer before he did. He finally spoke of a night, years ago, when he had been tracking a wounded fox near the slope behind the abandoned Dunlow cabin. The forest was unnaturally quiet, he said, the kind of silence that doesn't just settle but presses against the skin. As he approached the clearing, he noticed the fox's blood trail disappear abruptly, as if something had lifted the animal entirely off the ground. That was strange enough, but what disturbed him more was the sense of being watched, not in the way a deer might observe from a distance, but with an intent that felt almost human. He described seeing movement behind the cabin, a hunched shape that shifted with a fluidity inconsistent with any creature he knew. When Elias pressed him to describe it, the hunter shook his head, insisting that the shape didn't stay the same long enough for the mind to grasp. He said he saw limbs but couldn't determine how many, a head but not where it should have been, a body that seemed to flicker between sizes, as though it couldn't decide what form to settle into. His voice trembled slightly as he admitted that his flashlight dimmed the moment the figure moved toward him, a slow, dragging motion accompanied by a faint sound, something that wasn't quite breathing but resembled it just enough to twist the stomach. He fired a warning shot into the air, and whatever he saw retreated with impossible speed, vanishing behind the trees without leaving tracks. What lingered with him afterward wasn't the sight itself but the sensation that the creature understood he had seen it and had chosen to let him leave. He warned Elias not to go near the cabin alone, insisting that whatever lived in those woods wasn't an animal and wasn't a ghost either. It was something that had been born wrong, shaped by generations of interwoven blood, something that learned to survive in the shadows where light hesitated to reach. Elias didn't give much weight to the strange symbols at first, assuming they were nothing more than the idle carvings of hunters or passing teenagers. But the deeper he ventured into the Dunlow woods, the more he realized the markings were not random, and certainly not recent. The first one he noticed was etched into the trunk of an enormous oak, its bark thick and ancient. The shape was a circle intersected by two uneven lines, almost like a crude compass that pointed nowhere. He reached out to trace it, feeling the grooves cut deep, too deep for a pocketknife or an animal's claw. The wood within the carving had darkened with age, suggesting it was decades old, perhaps even older. As he continued walking along the narrow path that led toward the abandoned cabin, he found more symbols, each slightly different but connected by the same strange geometry. Some were larger and spiraled outward like coils, others were smaller and clustered together, as if marking a boundary. The air around these symbols felt different, heavier, as if the forest held its breath. Elias took photographs, but even through the camera lens the carvings seemed distorted, the lines blending into the bark in ways that made his eyes ache. What truly unsettled him was how precisely the symbols matched sketches he had seen earlier in the Dunlow family Bible stored at the courthouse. The Bible itself was an unsettling artifact, filled not only with genealogies and birth dates but with drawings tucked between the pages, odd diagrams that looked more like ritual markings than annotations. At the time, Elias assumed they had been doodles or personal codes used by the family, but seeing the same shapes carved into trees miles deep in the forest made him reconsider. These weren't private symbols, they were territorial. The Dunlows had marked these woods deliberately, as though claiming or warning others of something inside. Further along the trail, he discovered a cluster of symbols arranged in a circle around a clearing. The ground inside the ring felt unnaturally soft, as though it had been disturbed repeatedly over time. Elias knelt to examine it, brushing aside leaves to find tightly packed soil, too smooth to be natural. He felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine as he realized the pattern resembled the shape of the Dunlow family tree, closed, looping endlessly, refusing to branch outward. It was as if the forest itself had been inscribed with the family's twisted lineage. He sensed, with increasing certainty, that the markings weren't simply meant to guide or record, they were meant to contain. Something had been kept within these boundaries for generations, its existence woven into the bark and soil long before Elias arrived to disturb it. Elias first met the old woman by accident, though later he would wonder if she had been waiting for him. She sat on the sagging porch of a weather-beaten house on the outskirts of town, her frame small but her presence unnervingly sharp. Her eyes followed him before he even introduced himself, as if she already knew why he had come. When he mentioned the Dunlows, her expression hardened, the lines on her face deepening as though she carried the weight of every secret that family left behind. She told him, in a voice roughened by age and cigarettes, that she was the last living relative with any memory of the final Dunlow generation. But instead of sharing stories, she made one thing immediately clear: he needed to stop digging. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen consequences unfold, someone who understood that some histories didn't want to be uncovered. Her warning wasn't dramatic, it was practical, almost weary. She said that knowledge had a way of waking the things people tried to bury, and the Dunlow woods had been quiet for a long time only because no one had dared disturb them. Elias, however, pressed gently, hoping she would give him even scraps of information. Her demeanor shifted from stern to frightened so quickly it startled him. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper, as though the trees outside her window could hear them. She admitted that when she was a girl, the adults spoke of the final Dunlow child in hushed, terrified tones. Not because the child had done anything, but because of what the child was. She never saw it herself, yet she claimed the look in the elders' eyes told her enough. They described the mother's desperate flight into the woods, the sound of her sobs fading into the trees, and the dreadful silence afterward. There were nights, she said, when strange movements flickered along the tree line, too low to be a person but too deliberate to be an animal. People avoided the woods, especially at dusk, and parents kept their children close after dark. When Elias asked what the child looked like, she shook her head violently. She insisted no one could describe it without losing their voice or their composure. The few who tried spoke in broken phrases, contradicting themselves, as though their minds refused to settle on a single image. She believed that generations of cousin marriages twisted something inside the last Dunlow bloodline, birthing a child that carried the imprint of every genetic fold. She warned him that the woods had a memory of their own, shaped by those who wandered into them and never came out. Her voice wavered as she said that if Elias continued his search, the forest might remember him too. The first time Elias heard a scream in the woods, he was certain it was an animal, a fox or a coyote, perhaps, but the sound lingered far too long, rising and falling with a cadence that felt almost intelligent. It split the night with a sharpness that clawed at his chest, a sound that seemed to come not from one place but all around him. He had been following the narrow path toward the old Dunlow cabin, flashlight swinging nervously in his hand, when the noise shattered the stillness. Leaves rustled violently overhead, though there was no wind, and the branches seemed to bend with an unnatural weight. His pulse accelerated as the scream repeated, this time quieter, closer, almost within reach, yet elusive. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but some stubborn curiosity rooted him to the spot, forcing him to move forward into the darkness. Then came the claw marks. At first, Elias thought a branch had snapped against the side of his car, parked haphazardly near the tree line. But as he approached, he realized the deep gouges on the metal weren't caused by wood. They were deliberate, long, and jagged, etched as though by a hand or a claw with enough strength to tear through steel. The scratches extended along the passenger door, their angles jagged and uneven, as if the assailant had been both careful and curious. Elias ran his fingers along the grooves, feeling the sharp ridges beneath his gloves, and a chill settled deep in his bones. There was something alive in those woods, something aware, and it had left a message. It had seen him, and it had been testing him. He retraced his steps slowly, ears straining for the slightest hint of movement. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a warning. His flashlight flickered again, this time plunging him into brief moments of total darkness, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against him. The scream returned, this time closer, more guttural, and accompanied by a low growl that vibrated through the ground beneath his boots. It wasn't a sound any normal animal could make, it carried intelligence, menace, and curiosity all at once. Elias realized that the forest wasn't just inhabited, it was patrolled, monitored by something that belonged to the shadows. Fear rooted him to the ground, yet he could not leave. Every instinct, every rational thought screamed to retreat, but something in the depth of the scream called to him, compelling him onward. The clawed marks on his car were not random, they were deliberate, an introduction, a reminder of what had emerged from the twisted lineage of the Dunlows. It was as if the final child, or whatever it had become, was announcing its awareness, testing boundaries, marking territory, and daring him to continue deeper into the woods where generations of secrets waited to be uncovered. The diary arrived unexpectedly, tucked between brittle pages of the Dunlow family Bible Elias had painstakingly studied in the courthouse archives. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, almost as if it had been handled with trembling hands for decades, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew and iron. The handwriting inside was small, precise, and occasionally jagged, as though the author had written in bursts of fear and exhaustion. Elias realized almost immediately that it belonged to the mother of the final Dunlow child, the woman who had vanished into the woods all those years ago. Each entry was dated meticulously, capturing the rhythm of her daily life, but as he read on, the diary began to shift in tone. The mundane records of meals, chores, and conversations with distant relatives gave way to something darker, something intimate and agonizing. She wrote of changes in her body, of fear that the life growing inside her was not entirely human, of dreams where the child's face contorted into shapes that no eye should see. The more Elias read, the more palpable her terror became, a sensation that seemed to seep off the pages and settle around him. She described moments when the forest seemed to call to her, whispers she could almost understand, murmurs that urged her to leave the town and disappear into the trees. Her words grew frantic, her sentences jagged with uncertainty and dread, as though the child inside her had begun to exert its own will. She wrote that she had tried to speak to doctors, to clergy, anyone who could reassure her that what she felt was normal, but each attempt ended in frustration and disbelief. She began to sense that the child was a culmination of generations of carefully folded bloodlines, a being shaped by the repeated intertwining of cousins, carrying echoes of every anomaly, every mutation, every secret the family had cultivated. She feared that her offspring would be impossible for others to comprehend, that its very presence would twist the world around it. There were entries marked with symbols matching the ones Elias had seen carved into the trees, circles intersected by lines, spirals, strange sigils that seemed protective and warning all at once. She wrote that these marks were meant to contain the child, to guide it and herself toward safety, but even then, she admitted doubt. She recorded moments when the child moved before it should, when the kick of a limb or the shift of a shape beneath her hands didn't feel like the gentle stirrings of a normal infant. Her final entries, written in a hurried, almost illegible scrawl, conveyed her decision to leave the town and flee into the forest with the child, describing her hope and terror in equal measure. Elias felt the weight of her fear, and it became clear that the diary was not just a record of pregnancy, it was a warning, a plea, and a map of the unknown she had carried into the darkness, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the woods for generations. When Elias finally reached the abandoned Dunlow cabin, the air around it felt heavier than the surrounding forest, thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The structure was barely standing, its roof sagging, walls bowed, and windows darkened with years of dust and grime. At first glance, it looked deserted, a relic of time, left to rot quietly among the trees. But as he stepped closer, he began to notice subtle signs of recent activity, small details that unsettled him more than the silence ever could. Footprints in the softened soil led from the tree line to the cabin door, shallow and irregular, as if something had moved cautiously, avoiding detection. Twigs and leaves that had settled over the path were disrupted, bent in ways that suggested a presence had brushed against them not long ago. Even the inside of the cabin bore traces of life, a thin layer of ash in the fireplace, fresh enough to have burned within the last days, and small piles of sticks arranged deliberately in corners, like markers or warnings. Elias's flashlight revealed more anomalies as he explored the interior. Furniture was shifted slightly, as if someone or something had moved through, leaving evidence of its passage. A chair was overturned, not entirely collapsed but angled in a way that suggested someone had left it quickly, almost running. The table bore scratches too precise to be accidental, deep lines that carved shapes vaguely familiar to Elias, reminding him of the strange symbols from the trees and the diary. The air inside the cabin was damp, but not stagnant. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent of iron, of something organic and alive, lingering in corners where decay had long settled. Even the walls seemed to hold movement. Shadows flickered against the surfaces, though Elias could detect no wind or source of light that would create them. He felt eyes, something unseen, tracking him, following his every movement, measuring his presence in the space the cabin occupied. He could hear the faintest creak underfoot, the subtle scuff of unseen steps, and the brushing of something small against the floorboards. It was as though the cabin itself remembered, responding to his intrusion with awareness. Outside, the surrounding forest seemed to lean toward the cabin, trees forming a natural barricade, and the silence pressed in, thick and deliberate. Even the birds were absent, as if the usual chorus of evening sounds had been suppressed, deliberately silenced by the presence lingering within. The cabin's stillness was a trap, a waiting room for something that had not left despite appearances. Every broken board, every shifted object, every shadowed corner told Elias the same thing. The place had been touched recently, prepared, or perhaps watched. Whatever had been born of the Dunlow line was not gone, and the cabin had become a vessel of its presence, a threshold between the human world and the unnatural secret that had long been hidden in the woods. Elias's exploration of the area behind the cabin led him to the collapsed well, half swallowed by moss and undergrowth, a remnant of the property's long-neglected infrastructure. The stones were slick with moisture, their edges rounded from decades of weather, yet as he approached, he noticed something that immediately set him on edge. The soil around the well had been disturbed recently, churned and compacted in unnatural patterns. At first, he thought it might have been the work of animals digging for shelter or food, but the arrangements told a different story. Bones, small and brittle, some no longer complete, were scattered deliberately, forming shapes that suggested intention rather than chance. They were aligned in circles and lines, crossing one another in strange geometric patterns that mirrored the symbols carved into the forest trees. The more he examined, the more he realized these were not simply remains of animals. Several fragments bore unmistakable human characteristics, though aged and weathered beyond immediate recognition. Elias knelt, running his gloved fingers lightly along one of the longer bones, and noticed the careful placement. It wasn't haphazard, every piece had been arranged with purpose, a design meant to convey something or to mark a territory, a ritual that had survived beyond the memory of any living soul. The arrangement extended beyond the immediate edge of the well, spiraling outward, and he could sense the intention behind it: containment, protection, perhaps even invocation. The Dunlows had not simply abandoned their secrets, they had preserved them, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of soil, roots, and decay. Each bone acted as a marker, a silent testament to the twisted lineage and the events that no living witness could fully recount. The smell of damp earth and decayed matter pressed against him, mingling with the faint iron tang of blood long since absorbed into the soil. Shadows from the moon flickered across the bones, casting elongated, grotesque shapes that seemed to crawl along the ground. The wind, or what little moved in the thick forest, carried a whispering sound, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Elias's skin prickle. It was as if the bones themselves had memory, a residue of the generations of fear, secrecy, and unnatural births that had occurred here. The patterns, the careful construction, the symbolism, they all hinted at a deliberate act meant to contain something powerful, something that could not be allowed to roam freely. Elias understood, with an increasing sense of dread, that he had stumbled upon a ritual of preservation, a warning left by those who had lived and died in the shadow of the Dunlow bloodline. The collapsed well was more than just a structure, it was a portal, a focal point for the unnatural lineage, a place where generations of twisted secrecy had been physically anchored into the earth. And yet, as he peered into the darkness at the center of the spiral, he felt something stir, a presence aware of his intrusion, waiting, and measuring him, as if the forest itself was preparing to confront him with the consequences of uncovering the past. Elias had expected the encounter to be abstract, something glimpsed in the shadows or hinted at through diaries, symbols, and rumors. He had not expected the confrontation to be immediate, tangible, and overwhelming. As he stood at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, where the arranged bones and disturbed soil hinted at ritualistic preservation, he finally saw it, a figure that defied understanding. At first, it appeared almost human, a small frame crouched low to the ground, limbs shifting unnaturally, bending at angles no ordinary body could achieve. Its movements were fluid, liquid almost, yet deliberate, as though each step, each motion had intent. Elias felt the hairs on his neck rise, the air grew colder, thicker, pressing against his chest with the weight of centuries of hidden bloodlines. The forest around them seemed to hold still, waiting for recognition, as if the trees themselves had been expecting him to arrive. The child's face, or what could be called a face, was the most disorienting. Features seemed to change when he looked directly at it. One moment, wide, staring eyes stared back at him with startling clarity, the next, the eyes melted into dark hollows. Its mouth shifted unpredictably, as though unable to settle on a single expression. Elias understood immediately why the townspeople had said it could not be described. It was not that it lacked form, it was that form itself refused to obey the rules humans understood. The creature carried the imprint of generations of intertwined bloodlines, a physical manifestation of a family twisted by centuries of cousin marriages, each generation imprinting something unnatural, something inhuman, onto the next. Despite its alien shape, Elias felt intelligence, awareness, and something akin to emotion radiating from the figure. It studied him with a patience that unsettled him more than aggression ever could. Its body shifted slightly, exploring the space between them, testing him, measuring boundaries. Every instinct told him to flee, but fascination anchored him in place. He realized this being had lived its entire existence in hiding, shaped not only by blood but by secrecy, by the need to remain unseen. It had been waiting for someone from the outside to arrive, someone with fresh blood, someone whose presence could be measured against the centuries of isolation and genetic entanglement that had created it. Elias noticed details that made the being's unnatural origin undeniable: fingers too long and jointed oddly, skin mottled in ways that suggested both human and something else, a faint shimmer under the dim light of the forest. Every element of its appearance whispered of a lineage deliberately folded in on itself, producing a life that could not be recognized or explained by ordinary eyes. And yet, in its awareness, there was a certain melancholy, a sense of isolation that mirrored the generations it descended from. It existed as both culmination and warning, the final outcome of a family whose obsession with bloodlines had created something that the world had no words for, something that had been quietly waiting in the woods for anyone foolish enough or curious enough to find it.